My goal has been, how do we go in these neighborhoods? How do we buy the block and do it without displacing the existing residents? So it took me about 2 or 3 years to really come up with a model that would work. I bought the property in 2013, but I really didn't know what I was going to do with it. Um, and eventually I came in and I put these key pieces together. So if we can go in the communities, we can invest in the vacant property, in the abandoned property, in the neglected property, the drug houses, the houses that attract criminal activity, right? Not going on knocking on doors, asking seniors to sell their house, not taking advantage of people that are in desperate financial situations. Let's focus on these properties in the first bullet. Number one. Number two, try to keep rental rates affordable if you're going to go in the community and buy rental properties. Okay. That what that means is sometimes you're taught go in and renovate it and make it as nice as possible, which means your investment has to be larger on the front end. In exchange, you have to demand more for the rent, right? But if you can buy a rental property that's in decent condition and the tenant is happy with the way it is, you don't have to invest so much on the front end. You can still structure a deal where you get a good return if you're a good negotiator, where you buy it at the right price. So then the person can stay right there where they are. And the third component is one of the hardest components. How do we prevent home ownership loss due to higher taxes? That's going to be more of a political play where we have to get with politicians that do this in others. It's already implemented in some cities where if you've owned your home for longer than a certain amount of time, you're exempt from property tax increases. So that needs to be something that we need to focus on in these communities to make this buy the block model really work without being a detriment to the community. Okay, so when is the right time to buy in these neighborhoods? Okay, here's a couple of key points. I'm not talking about a war zone. I'm not talking about I'm not talking about anywhere it's super hood. We are talking about areas and communities where there's already some sign of something positive happening. Okay, and just remember, even if you see an abandoned community that looks like it has a lot of potential, bullet number two is very important. It's harder for you to spark this revitalization and get a return on your investment if you are the only catalyst. You have to go in the communities where there's already something kind of going on, and we still have an opportunity to step in front of it. And instead of trying to stop, the redevelopment and calling it gentrification, let's participate in it. Let's control the narrative. Let's control parts of everything that's going on in the community. Okay. So things you want to look for when you see announcements of projects in the newspaper, on the news, city council meetings, from other people that are in real estate that people that are networking with developers or builders, people in your community that are investors. When you hear these types of announcements, and that lets you know something is coming. The second Burger King figures out where McDonald's put a land purchase contract in, they're going to try to buy land right next to them, right? Same thing with Walgreens and CVS. So as the smaller guys in this play, as we're trying to independently control and buy back these blocks, we need to be following the big boys. It's going to happen. We can't fight them. We can't stop them. So we might as well participate. Another good thing to look at is the city activity. When city activity picks up in a neighborhood, on the private real estate side, okay? When a particular neighborhood where you didn't see any new construction before, now you start seeing for sale signs and you see active construction work going on, that's probably a good community, especially if it's one of our communities. That's a good time for you to start saying, okay, this might be a neighborhood that I might want to look at trying to buy the block with, okay? And then the city initiatives to spark redevelopment, that's on the public side. So when you see the city going into community and they're repaving streets, and they're putting in sidewalks, and they're updating signs, and they're putting in bike paths, they're doing all of that because that's kind of the extent that the public, the government can do to entice developers. They want developers to see this and investors to see this and say, okay, this is a neighborhood I want to be in. So if you look for these signs before all the houses have gone up and before everything looks nice, these are neighborhoods that we should be trying to buy the block in, especially if they are communities. So how do we successfully execute buying back the block? Okay, so number one, when it comes to buying blocks, if you're going to do something bigger than individual houses, you don't want to get a big plan together. You don't want to spin your wheels on things if you do not have site control. Site control is the single most important part of that process, because what happens is you put this tremendous plan together and either the seller decides they don't want to sell, or you don't have all of the properties together that you need for the project, or they get wind of something else and they increase their price on you. And so all of these factors will end up with you doing all this work, all this planning, and then you have no property to actually use it for. So all that time and money is wasted, right? So there's several ways you get site control. Number one, just make sure you have the property under a solid contract at a set purchase price with a certain time frame on it. Okay, that way, if it's one piece of property that you need for this entire project, then you know you have control of that. Number two is kind of, obvious, outright purchase, but that's not practical in most situations. Just going out and buying a whole block and paying for it cash is not really practical. And then the third one is an option to purchase. So if you have a project that you want to take on, and let's say it's 5 or 6 different owners, 7 different owners, and you don't know if all of them are going to want to sell. You don't know if their price points are going to be reasonable if they do want to sell. What you want to do is execute options to purchase. And what that is you go from owner to owner and you say, hey, Mr. Owner, let's negotiate. Let's come to a price that we both agree on. I'm not buying your property today, but if you give me a year, you give me 2 years, and I can pull this thing together that I'm trying to do, you have to allow me to buy your property at this price. Okay. In exchange for that, I'm gonna give you this money. Could be $1,000, could be $500, whatever. Hey, if you never hear from him again, this is your $1,000. But if I come back to you in a year and I'm ready to buy, then we have to follow through on this contract. And so that allows you to control each individual parcel until you get them all together for the project that you're trying to do. Okay, next most important step is planning and design, because you have to really understand what it's going to take to pull this concept off that you're trying to implement. Now, if you're trying to buy more than one property and they're rental properties, like I said earlier, and there's already tenants there, then this process is going to be a lot easier for you because you don't have a lot of work to do on the front end, right? You don't have a lot of expenses that in the real estate development world is called soft costs. These are things that are intangible. Like once you spend the money's gone. Once you pay an architect for design work, whether the project gets started or not, that's gone, right? The permitting fees, paying for engineers, all that kind of stuff. Construction, of course, construction is going to be one of your biggest expenses because you want to make sure that while you have site control, you really understand what the cost of this entire project is going to be. And then you want to make sure that planning and zoning and city ordinance or whatever in your area and just the general city permit approvals are in place for you to be able to execute your project. And most importantly, all of this is really that all of that comprises feasibility of whether buying this block and doing whatever you plan to do with it really makes sense. Okay, now, so after you get site control and you've got a good plan together, then you have to figure out how you're actually going to take down the project and how you're going to start the project. So my number one go-to is what's been working for me in Houston is seller financing. If I would have waited in 2013 for a bank to tell me that I was bankable to buy a whole block, and I was waiting for a bank to tell me that a block in the hood was worth a certain amount of money when there were no recent sales and it was full of crime and drug infestation, I would have never got that project off the ground. So, but what happens when you go to somebody that owns the property outright? Okay, that means it's probably been in their family longer than 30 years, or it's maybe passed down from generation to generation, and they have the right, the free and clear right to do whatever they want with the property. You can negotiate with them. And so for one of my properties, I'm gonna show you in a case study. One of them, I negotiated 10% down to buy a whole block. The second one, I had to come to the table with 50% of the agreed upon purchase price. But then you make payments to them instead of making payments to a bank. And they're not going to check your credit score. They're not going to do a background check. They're not going to ask you about other things, because when sellers finance something directly to you, they know that if you default, they can just take the property back and they can start the process over, do the same thing again, right? So that's a trick. Well, that's not really a trick, but that's a technique that we need to implement more often when we're trying to get in our communities and do these things. So something else, if they don't agree to that, or if they do agree to that, but you don't have enough money for the down payment, start off with a small group of investors. Maybe I would always suggest you have somebody on your team that's experienced with investing, and have them come on a team and help you through the process. I highly suggest you don't do it if you're all newbies and you have nobody on the team, because what may seem like a good deal may not be a good deal. And then third is crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is what I did for one of my projects, but I didn't do a crowdfunding until I had been in real estate investing for almost 13 years. Okay. So a lot of people ask about it, but when you take other people's money, you know, and you are trying to complete a project, all those bullet points before that got to be spot on, because people are not giving you donations. They are giving you money, and they are expecting their money back, and they're expecting a profit on top of that. So, you know, you got to be really careful when you get in that realm. And most importantly, of all of these things, is the right team. You can have the right plan. You can have every box checked, but if you don't have the right team to execute on buying back the block, it'll be very hard for you to be successful. Now, the most important key is that we all have to participate. And this is what I mean by that. The investors need to be participating in this, okay? We need to be actively looking to buy in our communities, okay? If you're a landlord, maybe you don't want to actually live in the community, but you have rental properties. You should be trying to control rental properties in these same neighborhoods. And you can maybe one investor has bought the block and renovated the block, and now they're selling the homes to other people. Well, you as an investor should come in and buy some of the properties from that developer, so that the ownership transfers from us to us, right? And then you, as someone who looks like the community, should be looking out for people in the community and have a vested interest in not being a slumlord and taking care of the community. Of course, realtors play an integral part of this. Why? Because when you have buyers, when you have investors, when you have renters, you should be telling them about all of the investors, landlords, developers, builders you know in the community, and trying to steer them to these neighborhoods first. Once again, I'm not talking about war zones. Okay, I'm talking about areas that there's already some sign of revitalization. And lastly, and most importantly, the regular buyers. Like for my development, that I'm showing you in a second, all of my buyers look like us, young working professionals. It's not as bad. It's not the hood that sometimes people say it is. You have to be very aware of what outside narratives are versus what's really there. So as a buyer, if you're in a community and some of those other signs have already talked about are happening, if you see redevelopment starting, if you see a lot of activity in the community, if you see the city putting things in, guess what? That city's already got that neighborhood on their radar. Even though it may not be perfect yet, it's coming. And usually what happens is we go to the community one day and it's the hood, and we go back a year later and it's $1 million homes, and we're like, what happened? And we're mad, and it's gentrification. It's like, no, what really happened was from the time you left, other people saw value in their community and they started buying. And not everybody's buying rental properties. People are really moving in their community. They're walking their dogs, they're riding their bikes, and the values are steadily going up. And then by the time we get wind of what's going on in the community, the prices are so high we can't afford it, right? So that's usually what happens.
My graduates from my school being Forbes, bag drop.
Bag drop.
A mic drop, bag drop.
Bag drop.